Hello folks, this is Arman with Metaspec. Thanks for joining. Today we're going to have a forensic email collector power user workshop, and we're going to cover quite a few things. I'll kind of outline those for you so you have a general understanding of what will happen. We will start with some of the newer functionality that we introduced in forensic email collector, such as differential acquisitions and Credential Manager. And then we will move on to something new that's coming up. I will actually walk you through it. We haven't released it yet, but it's getting very close. And we will also touch on a pretty common search-related e-discovery / forensics concept. And I would say if you haven't given it a lot of thought, then you might find it kind of interesting. So it's kind of a thought exercise, and then I will show you how we tackle this for forensic email collector, and then we can go from there. We'll leave a little bit of time as usual for questions and answers. So if you have anything, feel free to direct those questions to me over chat wherever you're watching this, and I'll be happy to answer it. So I will start by sharing my screen with you to go over differential acquisitions first. But before that, I guess let me start by talking about what is differential acquisitions and why we created them. So, in the past, forensic email collector had two main methods of reducing the data that it's collecting. One of them is selecting the data points that we're collecting. So it could be narrowing things down by specific API points that we're hitting, like Google Drive versus Calendar versus just Gmail, for example, in the case of email. Or it could be within a provider, maybe selecting certain email folders to narrow things down directly. The second mechanism was in-place searches, and we've done quite a bit of work in that area, built user interfaces around them, and put them to good use to instantly narrow down data sets very successfully. Now we've introduced two additional mechanisms. One of them has already been released, and that is differential acquisitions. And the second one, I'll talk at the end. I'll talk about it at the end. So differential acquisitions essentially is a mechanism to set up a new acquisition that'll look back at what has been done before and exclude any previously successfully acquired messages from the new acquisition for the same mailbox. So the use case here is, there are a few use cases, obviously. One of them is you might have an acquisition where you did the acquisition with in-place search, and maybe the specifications changed, so the legal team came back and said, oh, you know what, we should have added this additional search term here. So now we have to revise the search, but you don't necessarily want to recollect everything you've collected before. You want to just get the delta and collect what was in there in the first run. Another valuable use case for this is, let's say that you're doing a large scale acquisition of hundreds of mailboxes, and you're on a timeline, as we usually are, and maybe you don't have time to collect everything and put it in front of the legal team before they get going. So you want to target first the very highly responsive documents, super hot documents with a very narrow in-place search, which you could do within hours, basically, over on hundreds of mailboxes, even if it's that large a scale, because in-place searches run very fast. So you could do a very targeted search, get the results of that search, which will be the key documents essentially, give them to the legal team to look at, and then while they're working on that, you can do your supplemental differential acquisitions that'll exclude those items and do a broader, either a broader search or just unsearched whole mailboxes, basically, for subsequent search and processing. And then another use case is that you might have, or your client might have, an ongoing discovery obligation where they have to prepare ongoing document productions. So maybe they have to, for example, monitor all their mailboxes and keep producing on a rolling basis whatever is new that's responsive to certain search criteria. So what you could do is you could batch create the acquisitions with something like, with FEC in this case, put them all in a folder, and they run. And then you can create scheduled supplemental acquisitions that have a differential acquisition source that looks back at what has been done before, and for each mailbox it excludes what it collected in the past, and it can do that on a rolling basis. So acquisition 2 looks back at acquisition 1, acquisition 3 looks back at acquisitions 1 and 2, and 4 looks back at acquisitions 1, 2, 3. So they keep going, building on each other, so you can have this pipeline of ongoing productions essentially without too much deduplication effort, and much less overhead, because you're not going to be collecting all that time and time again. You'll just do the acquisition once and just keep going with deltas. So we achieve this with a few different settings, so I'll show you what that looks like on a simple acquisition and a couple of different options we have there, and then we can move on to the next thing. So I'll share my screen with you here. All right, so let's fire up Forensic Email Collector and do a little test acquisition first that'll serve as the basis for our differential acquisition later. So I'm gonna load a remote authenticator token that I've created before. For those of you who are not familiar with Forensic Email Collector, this is not required. You could authenticate on the spot too, but to keep things simple, I'll just use something that I've done before. So I imported this token for this mailbox. I'll target it, skipping over these server settings for Gmail API. I'll go with a vanilla acquisition just to demonstrate differential acquisitions. So this is my first acquisition of its kind, so there is no differential acquisition path or anything like that. I will pick an output path. In this case, let's call it 1, and then I will run an in-place search. I don't want to collect all nearly 3,000 items now, so I will load a search query from file, get these search terms in here. If I were to execute them, it's going to result in 639 items. Fine. I will save and acquire those. So that shouldn't take too long. Take a sip of water. All right, so that one is done. So let's say that the legal team came back after I ran this acquisition, and here were my search terms that I used. And let's say that they said, you know what, we forgot a search term, so we want you to add ticket to these terms. Let's save this as a new one. Search terms new. So we have an additional search term now. So how do we go and run a new acquisition, but we don't collect the 639 that we have just acquired? So we can create our new acquisition, load the authentication token again, put it as our target. This time I set a differential acquisition path. So it's important to note that this is not a file. So we're not pointing at a specific Forensic Email Collector project. We're pointing at a folder, and the reason for that is we want FEC to be able to scan the whole folder and find everything that matches. Like I said before, there might be multiple sets of prior acquisitions, so the differential acquisition source doesn't have to be a single acquisition. It could be 10 acquisitions that happened in the past for the same mailbox. So because of that, we point to a folder. So I'm going to point to this first acquisitions folder. In this case, I have only one. So that'll be my differential acquisition path here. And let's see, let's call this 2. And this time I'm going to run my revised search. So I'll go load this search terms new from there, which has the additional ticket term. So let's see how much of a difference that makes. We had, I think, 639. We are at 676 items now. So let's use this as the query and start our acquisition. So you'll see that we found the 676 items, but out of those, so that's in parentheses, we see that we ended up with 37 items. So the 639 that we done in the past get eliminated immediately, and we are reduced to the 37 that we are to acquire now. Now there are a couple of interesting things here to look at in the logs that you should be aware of. One of them is when you look at the acquisition log now for this differential acquisition, the acquisition summary section is a little bit broader than before. You're going to see some additional information about the total items in FEC snapshot, and then total items excluding differential IDs, that's 37, so that's what we ended up collecting essentially. And downloaded items 37, so we collected all of them. And the total differential acquisition IDs on 639, so that's the number of differential IDs that we are excluding from things. And when we look at our diff excluded items log, which is a new one, there we have the items that we've excluded on the basis of them being a match in a prior acquisition, and the differential source column indicates the source of that prior acquisition, which makes sense in the case of multiple prior acquisitions. So in this case, we have only one project, so they all show that. But if you had 10 prior projects in different points in time, then for each item, you're going to have a specific one that matched your item, and that is the reason why that specific item was excluded. So to show that, and to show a second mechanism how you could do differential acquisitions, let's do a second differential acquisition, and this time let's cherry pick some items and exclude them partially. So that might be some edge cases where you may not want to exclude an entire acquisition, but maybe exclude only certain items from an acquisition. So that's what I'll try to do now. So I have my acquisition 2 here. I'm gonna go get the downloaded items log from this acquisition 2 and pick about 20 items here and get these in a text file. So all we need are the service IDs for differential acquisition for API project. For IMAP, you would also need the IMAP folder where they're coming from. So let's place this here in our out folder, and we're going to name this in the same syntax as the FEC project, but diff.tsv for tab separated values. In this case, this is not tab separated, but if we had the folder as well, then FEC would expect that folder column to be tab separated. So we have that, and like I said, I don't want to exclude this acquisition 2 entirely. I want to exclude only 20 items from it. So just for demonstration purposes, normally I wouldn't do this, but I'm going to delete that so it's not in my output folder there. And then I'm going to create my third acquisition now. And in this case, my goal is to exclude whatever was in acquisition 1 and only the 20 items from acquisition 2. So I'm going to create that. And again, we're hitting that same poor Gmail mailbox that we've been hammering. And the differential acquisition path will be this out folder because I want to be able to get both. And my output path is going to be 3. Now here's an interesting thing that you should be aware of. You might be thinking, well, we're taking the differential acquisition base path as the out folder, our out, but we're also writing to the out folder in our new acquisition. So is that not going to confuse things? But no, FEC will know that this is the current acquisition, so it's not going to touch the 3 folder or the contents that are coming in there, so it's not going to differentiate against itself. It's going to exclude this current acquisition and only look back at what we've done before. So that should be fine. And then I want to, again, run my same in-place search as before. The new search. No need to execute this now. Let's run it. So now I got down to 17 only. If you remember last time we had acquired 37, so I have excluded an additional 20 out of them. So now we're down to only 17 because of it. And when we look at what we have acquired, so if you look at the diff excluded items actually, you'll see that there are now 2 different differential sources that are the basis of our exclusion. One of them is the FEC project under ROUT1, which was the first acquisition, and the second is the tab separated values file, so the list file, which is a subset of the second acquisition. So needless to say, this can scale up virtually indefinitely. So you could have, maybe 100 differential acquisitions that FEC could look back, and this happens right after the in-place search and before the acquisition, so it does cut down acquisition time pretty dramatically. So this is an option that may not be immediately clear by looking at our documentation, although we have pretty good docs for this that outline how we set up the text-based file versus how you set up your differential acquisition base path. But I feel like this would be a good intro to get everybody used to using differential acquisitions when you need them. Now let's take a look at another thing that's fairly recent. I'll show you two things in one. One of them is Credential Manager, and in broader terms it's part of our pre-acquisition action, so I'll show you that menu as well. So let's go back and set up a new acquisition. Again, I'll target the same test mailbox. Again, for those of you not familiar with FEC, don't think FEC only connects to Gmail, but this is just the test mailbox that I have handy, so I'm just hitting Gmail here. So I will make a new acquisition here. Again, to cut to the chase, I will run an in-place search. This time let's make a pretty simple one for a single term. So I'll search for desk, for example. Let's see what turns up. Gmail API is taking its time this morning. Could be because I'm streaming on the same computer. So 176 search results. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to start acquiring this, but I want to start halfway through. All right, so I stopped here, and you see that as soon as I stop, there's a post-acquisition actions menu here, which we'll talk more in detail. This is essentially where we collected all the different things you could do after an acquisition has been kicked off. But one of them is Credential Manager, and one of the key features of this is to be able to swap out credentials. So this happened to a few of you, and it could happen at any time. Sometimes end users revoke your credentials before you've finished acquiring the mailbox. So let's say they created a remote authenticator token for you, which is great. You imported the token you're acquiring, and then something happened and they revoked access to that token. Maybe they thought that you were done, for example. So to simulate that, I will say clear credentials here. So this will clear that token out of this project, and now no credentials found to resume the acquisition, so I couldn't resume it even if I wanted to. But imagine that I didn't really manually clean it, but the end user actually kicked us out mid-acquisition. So what you could do is you can reopen this acquisition, and post-acquisition actions will be available. You could say manage credentials and import token, and you could put in a new token, and then you'll be off to the races. So this is a way to swap out your token with a replacement token if you need to. And in the context of legacy authentication like IMAP or some other provider that works on the basis of usernames and passwords, then the menu changes, and then it allows you to edit the password essentially. So let's say that the user had created an app password for you, you started and they changed it or they revoked it. If they supply a new password, you can go and edit that password, and you can resume your acquisition. Now, if I were to go look at this now, there is no option to clear credentials. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at what our output looks like here. I'm going to open the second session. And if you look at the end of this project, we see this line. It says all items were downloaded, clearing credentials. So what this means is when FEC is doing an acquisition, and if at the end of the acquisition it concludes that you've successfully acquired everything that you possibly could, and there's not going to be an opportunity to resume anymore, then it actually goes ahead and clears the credentials from the project anyway. So if that was username and password, it's gone. If there was a service account, gone. Authentication token, cleared. And this is pretty good in the context of, you know, most of the time you would advise the end user to either change their temporary password or revoke their app password or revoke their authentication token anyway after the completion of the acquisition. But I would say, you know, there's no reason to chance it and have a live token or credential in your acquisition when you don't need it. So that is controlled through this option here that says automatically close project. So what we mean by close is essentially clear credentials there. You could uncheck this and do it manually if you want to be not on the safe side, but if you just prefer having more control over it. But to be clear, if the project has not successfully completed, so if there are some remaining items and there is the opportunity to resume, then FEC would not clear the credentials. And if you, for whatever reason, determine that you're not going to be able to get those items, then you can go in and clear them yourself. So that's something you're able to do. And some other options here are things that you're probably used to from before. So there's the option to acquire and export metadata for remaining items, or maybe for the entire acquisition before you run it. So that'll be a metadata only acquisition. You could export logs as you have them now. You can package drive attachments if you did a drive type acquisition at any time. And again, if you're not familiar with this, this is not something that's an online action. This is an offline action, so it'll take whatever has already been acquired, and that goes really quickly. And there's a new one, relatively new, which is to clear permanent error flags. I don't imagine that you'll run into this often, but when you do, it's an important thing. So the permanent error flags here is this: when a FEC does an acquisition, and if it runs into any items that throw a not found error like a 404 or a permission error like 403, then FEC knows that, you know, those missing items are not going to magically reappear, or the permissions are not going to be automatically regranted at some point. So it determines that those are permanent errors that are not going to be resolved. So it marks them as such, and it won't include those items in its automatic retry attempts. It's not going to try to get them anymore. Essentially, it gives up on them. But there might be some very rare scenarios where that could change. We've had actually a few instances like that. So you might be able to go back and work with your client to, for example, give you some additional permissions to acquire drive items or something like that. So there might be a use case where you would want to actually clear those permanent error flags and force FEC to retry those items. So if that happens, then this is your ticket. You can hit this button, it'll clear those permanent error flags, and the next time you resume, FEC will try everything. FEC will try everything that hasn't been downloaded, regardless of the reason, essentially. So that's it for the post-acquisition actions. Now let's do an audit log acquisition. This is something that's relatively new, and I'll show you a couple of things there. So let's target an Office 365 account here. Oh, if I could spell it. All right. Let's call this A1. All right, let's clear the selection. So the audit log is essentially in this recoverable items audits folder, and there's going to be additional copies of this under, for example, archive root. If you have it, I have one up there as well. In this case, I have 1,452 items, and this used to be inaccessible, and things have changed, and we've updated FEC to be able to actually query this, acquire it, and even search it. So I'm going to target this folder. And I don't want to include the entirety of it, so what I'm going to do is I'll run an in-place search on this, which you can, just like you can search all the other item types. So I'm going to search. I'm going to try to exclude events based on, events where the client is Outlook Desktop or Outlook Desktop on Mac, and also I'll focus on the soft deletion. So I'll say something like not Outlook.exe or Mac Outlook, I think, and subject soft delete. Let's see. Yeah, we got 3 items there. So let's hit those 3 items and acquire them. Of course, these things have dates too, and you'll see some dates here as well. I'm not going to show you the exact item here. I'll show you a redacted version of it because it has some sensitive info there. So here is what it looks like in redacted form. So it does contain some interesting things. So in this case, the operation is a soft delete that succeeded. It gives you information about the mailbox GUID, the user's ID, and the client's real IP address, which is pretty cool. Originating server, some information about the the message ID of the message that was soft deleted, the subject of it. In this case, it was junk email from the junk email folder, so nothing to write home there. Is the thread index decodable here? Yeah, they have a valid thread index that matches the timing information here. So you can get some pretty interesting audit log information directly within FEC and narrow it down by the typical things that you could on Exchange Web Services. So that is a pretty neat new capability. And on the other side, if you're doing a mailbox acquisition and if you do not need or want the audit information, then you can just uncheck those folders and get rid of it. Maybe it's out of scope or whatever. So it's something to keep in mind. You may not always want it, but when you need it, it's good to have it. Now, the next thing I want to focus on is a convenience feature that we added, which is around capturing entry IDs from FEC's output PSTs. This is somewhat recent, and I'll start by talking about the rationale for it. So the idea here is this: in some cases, when you do an FEC acquisition or whatever type of acquisition, there might be some subsequent actions that you have to take on that data. For example, it might be that you're going to do a mailbox remediation, or you're going to tie things together, like link up drive attachments or something like that manually. So in a lot of cases, you may have to go back from what's inside your review tool or rediscovery tool or forensic tool and link things up with what is in FEC's downloaded items log, for example. And typically this is pretty straightforward if you use item level output, because each item is named as the identifier that it has, and then that is the ID of it in FEC's downloaded items log. So things link up really nicely, and I'll show you what that looks like. But in some cases, if you used a container as an output format, like a PST file, for example, and if you ingested that PST into a tool directly, so a tool that doesn't know how to import FEC's project file, then those service identifiers of those items are essentially disconnected, so you don't know what that item links to in FEC's downloaded items log, and it could be a little bit convoluted to link things up. So to work around that, we've started capturing these entry IDs so that it's very easy to match up. So I think it's better to just show you an example of what that looks like. So let's do a quick acquisition again. So let's hit the same mailbox as before. I'll choose PST and MIME here. Let's call this E1. Again, I want to run a search, so let's do the same desk search here. I don't even have to preview it now. So we got the search results 176. I think that's what we had the last time too when we did the Credential Manager stuff. So let's look at what this looks like on the back end. So when we look at our logs, what I was telling you earlier is this. So when you look at the downloaded items log, we have these identifiers that we assign to the items, and for item level output that matches the file name of the output file. So things are really easy. Even if you just ingest these CMLs into any discovery or forensic tool, you can always come back and find whatever row that corresponds to and get the service ID and Gmail labels, these hidden timestamps and all that you need. It's pretty straightforward. And actually, you can use it to overlay information from FEC's logs into your e-discovery and forensic tools, which is great. Now, let's simulate a scenario where somebody is using this information for review, for example. So we're going to get this info ingested into another tool. To do that, I'm going to use our forensic email intelligence, because that is a tool I could use for that, and I have it handy here on the desktop, so it'll be easy. So I'll do this two different ways. In the first case, I'm going to ingest FEC's project file, and when you ingest FEC's project file, FEI, forensic email intelligence, we'll be able to transfer over server metadata, service IDs and all that, and life will be good. And then we'll do the other way and show you how the entry IDs come into play. So let's go back and create a project here. Find our FEC project file. So when I'm doing an FEC to FEI handoff, I'm going to ingest the project file. I don't need to worry about the output, basically, because FEI will find the output and it'll ingest whatever it needs to get. That's going to be easy. So let's finish this up. Examine here. Let's auto-fit the columns. So if you look at what I have now, you'll see that I have my service IDs here. So these are the identifiers that we had in the downloaded items log, and they are what any tool would use to talk to Gmail API in this case and address those messages. So let's say that you wanted to do a mailbox remediation, and the legal team said, hey, I reviewed this mailbox and there's these items that we want to remediate, delete from the mailbox. Of course, if it's a few like this, it's easy anyway, but if it is hundreds or thousands, then you have to have these service IDs to be able to target them really easily. But so life is good here in this case. But let's say that we weren't able to load an FEC project directly because we were using a third-party tool that doesn't know how to work with an FEC project. So we created a project, and then into our tool we loaded FEC's output directly. So in this case, we went and we found the output PST, and we ingested that. Now the output PST does not contain the service identifiers because it doesn't have a mappy property for that, and we don't want to introduce anything new that's outside of what's already there. So you're not going to have those service identifiers if you just the PST. So let's assume that this is some other tool now, an discovery tool or review tool, and you're looking at the data, and the legal team reviewed all the stuff. They flagged a bunch of stuff. There are no service IDs here, so they went and let's see where the flags are here. So let's say that they went and picked these few items, they tagged them, and then let's narrow it down to just those tagged items. So they determined that these items need to be remediated, and they give you an export. So let's export these items. Call it export XLS. Let's go look at what this looks like. So they give you their export from whatever tool that they're using. They don't have service IDs because, well, like I explained before, they're not going to make their ways in there. But one thing that a PST has is entry identifiers for each item within the PST. So this is not something that the review tool creates, but it's something that's in the PST. And a DC discovery or a forensic tool would capture this at the item level. Now, the reason this is useful now is, let me clear this filter here. Okay, so when you look at FEC's logs now, downloaded items log, we have this entry ID captured here as well in base 64. So how can I get my service IDs populated in my remediation list? Well, I could make a column here, something like this. I can go back to my downloaded items log to make it easier on myself. I will carry these service IDs over here, column K, and then go back here to I think I just lost my VLOOKUP there. Yeah, let's do a VLOOKUP. So let's look this up in our downloaded items log. I want the second column, and I get my service IDs. So essentially, you can use these entry IDs that your eDiscovery or forensic tool would ingest, and you can use them to tie things back to FEC's downloaded items log and get whatever information you need from this back into your list. And now that you have your service IDs, this is all you need. You can pass this to Obliterator, and it will use them to target those specific messages and obliterate them. So for mailbox remediation, or there might be other use cases like drive file linkage, for example. That's something you do manually, and you could go back to FEC's download items log, and from there jump to the downloaded drive items and drive revisions logs and pull everything together. So easy breezy thanks to the entry IDs. So remember that that is there when you need it. Now I'm gonna focus now on something that's coming up that we haven't released yet, and for that I'm going to launch FEC 380, which we haven't released yet, so treat this as a beta essentially, but it's getting pretty close. So like I said at the beginning of this presentation, in the past, when we first launched FEC, we had essentially two mechanisms to narrow things down. One was by folders or by drive API, by target API endpoints. Another one was in-place searches, which was pretty comprehensive. And then recently we added differential acquisitions, so that became a third option for narrowing things down. And now there's a fourth option, and I'll show you what that looks like. So once again, I will target the same mailbox. Make a folder here. Now when you look in FEC 380, you'll see that there's the trusty in-place search as before, but there's an additional search mechanism here called Inline Search. So the difference is this: to refresh your memory, in-place search is something that happens on the server. So the main benefit there is, we take the search query, we pass it to the server executes the search, and it's nearly instantaneous. So it's extremely fast, and you don't even touch the rest of the data set. You only acquire the responsive items. So it's really desirable in some scenarios. But the downsides are, number one, different syntax and different capabilities among providers. So Gmail API might be able to do one thing that Yahoo can't, for example. And then it's kind of a black box, so you don't really get much feedback about what hasn't been indexed, what you couldn't search. And finally, capabilities. Generally, not many providers support everything in terms of attachments or different search operators like wildcards, regular expressions, and the detailed things that you may want to do in a forensic search you may not be able to do in an in-place search. So the inline search is here to, in a way, close that gap. So an inline search essentially is a powerful search engine that runs on the full contents of the messages after they've been acquired, but before they're written to disk. So it's essentially a series connection there. We get the item before we write it, we run it through the inline search engine to determine if we're gonna keep it or not. So if you were to run only an inline search, for example, then that would not be very fast because it would be similar in speed to acquiring the whole mailbox. So you're not going to save a whole lot, but it could come into play in a case where maybe you're working under a stipulation and you're not allowed to download certain emails that are not responsive, but they don't really mind you running an inline search in memory, basically, as long as you don't actually store those items. And the search is very detailed to the level that you cannot run an in-place search to achieve it. So inline search can come into play there. But I think the more exciting part is that because of the architecture we have here, you can layer these 4 different technologies essentially. So you can combine a folder level restriction with an in-place search, with a differential acquisition, and top it off with an inline search. All 4 of them go together in different layers. So you may not need all 4 in a lot of cases, but at a minimum, in-place search and inline search complement each other quite nicely to use the powers of each and remedy the weaknesses of each. For example, in-place search is a very fast method to do a date restriction. You could do a quick date search narrow things down significantly if it's a narrow date search. And then if you want to target something very specific within that date range, then you can leave that to the inline search to do with regular expressions or proximity terms or whatever else you need there. So essentially there are a few use cases, I would say, for inline search. One of them is that you might be working with a provider such as POP3 that doesn't search in place search at all. It could be that you're working with a provider that caps in-place search results, which is terrible, but it happens. So you can work around that search cap. You could be working with a provider with pretty limited search syntax or search coverage in terms of attachments and stuff, and you can work around that. Or in another use case, you might be able to use this to bring multiple providers to a common denominator. Because let's say that you have a large-scale project and you have a lot of targets, and some of them are in Gmail, some of them are on Yahoo, some are on AOL, iCloud, Exchange, Office 365, you name it. You have many different targets. Now, if you have a project specification or ESI protocol or whatever have you, and there's a search criteria that you have to follow. Each of these providers have a different search syntax and different capabilities, so you may not be able to follow it to a T in every provider, or their results or search methodologies would likely differ. So that could be problematic if you want to be, which you would, if you want to be consistent across the board in all your searches in all the providers. So in the past, you would have to do something like that offline, so you would have to collect in full or do the bare minimum like a date restriction in place and do the search offline to be able to be consistent in your search. Now you could do that part as an inline search as well as an additional option. I wouldn't say, in all cases, this is a great replacement to an offline search. In some cases, you might prefer an offline search, but in some cases, it might be a good replacement. So I'll show you how this works. The user interface, of course, we built a user interface around it, is similar to our in-place search user interface. Essentially, there's a text box here. There's the query builder, unified query builder, that has the same type of look regardless of what you're targeting. In this case, there's the participants and content. There's an addition here for content terms. So these are going to be the terms that run on the entire contents of the items. There's a date restriction part here. Of course, you can freeform compose your search here. There's a little right-click help for the different types of operators or the fields you can target. There are some search options here for how you want to treat search exceptions. So do you want to treat them as responsive or not responsive? Do you want to search both text and metadata or just metadata? And how do you want to handle attachments? Do you want to just search the parent email or attachments as well, where applicable? So there are a few search options there that they will make their way into your acquisition log in the search criteria section there. Now there's one difference here, and that is because this is not in place, we don't have a server to talk to get data or run a query against an index. So we can't just type a term here and preview like we could in an in-place search. But I know myself that I would want to be able to test my search, and I'm sure most of you would too. So to facilitate that, we built a pretty simple user interface here. What you can do is you can load an email here just as a sandbox email just to play with, essentially just to fine-tune your search. So it's shown here in abbreviated fashion, but this is a full email with attachments and whatnot. And you can load it here, and it's immediately indexed and ready to go. And you can test your search here. So you could run a search on, for example, position here. You will get, okay, this is responsive. What happens if I use a wildcard here? That'll work. If I use a single wildcard here, that is good. So you could do quite a few things, and we will prepare a detailed documentation on this soon. One of the benefits of this is that the date searches are quite a bit more detailed, which is great. In a lot of providers, you can come down to the level of a day, but because of that, you can't really specify a time zone. And if your search is supposed to be running, for example, Eastern time, and the provider is working off of universal time, then there might be a little gap in coverage there, so you might have to go broader than what you normally would in an in-place search on that provider. Gmail works around this nicely by using epoch dates if you want to, but not every provider does. So this inline search, because it's a full-blown search engine there, it can search to second precision. So I could run a search for something like, let's say, I want to search for just a broad date here. I could do something like this, and that would work. But I could also search for a range with something like, let's see, 12, 45, 18 to, let's copy and paste this here, 19, for example. And I could go up to second precision here. If I were to flip this to 19 seconds, it's not going to be responsive anymore because I'm beyond the range. So you could use this. I would imagine most of you would go to second precision on their date ranges unless you're an extremist. But you might want to go down to the hour level to be able to specify your time zone. So you could specify this in Eastern time or whatever time you need, essentially. So that's something good to know. Now I'm going to demonstrate a quick acquisition with this where I want to target emails within a time period. So I want to target emails in 2020, and I want to search for emails that have a specific IP address in their headers, which is something that's not easy to do. And then I want to search for a proximity phrase in their contents, including attachments. So I'm going to construct my search to show you how that would work. So I'm going to combine, in this case, an in-place search to do the heavy lifting of the date restriction, which will bring the volume down quite a bit. And then I'm going to hit it with an inline search to do that fine-tuning to get the IP address and the proximity search part. So let's do an in-place search for 2020, 2021 here. It'll look something like this. So that's activated. And then here, I want to search for the IP address in only the headers. So I'm not interested in the items that have the IP address in their bodies. So I'll use this headers term here. And I'm going to use a regular expression, because I can, to find the specific type of IP address that starts with 74. So I don't want to look for all IP addresses, but I want to look for IP addresses that start with 74. And that'll look something like this. We'll explain the syntax in our docs, but essentially these are doctets of the IP address. So this is a pretty crude regular expression. It doesn't really check the viability of the numbers, but as long as it's 74 separated by a dot and some numbers, we'll be fine. 1 to 3 digits, so it's a pretty crude regular expression for an IPv4 search. And then I want to search for in the document contents. I want to search for scenarios where the word software is within 3 editing distances, we say in this case, or within 3 words, you could say, of the phrase intellectual property. So let's say something like software intellectual property, and let's say 2 here. Let's make sure I spell this right. All right, so that should be it. So I have 2 different search queries activated here, and I'm going to hit the same mailbox. And the start of it will look very similar to an in-place search, because you'll see we narrow it down directly to 308 items. And then the in-place inline search is running as it goes. It is pretty fast, so you're not going to see much of an impact there. But if you look at our logs, you're going to see some extra detail now. You're going to see that we have the in-place search query here, and then we have an inline search query here, which is what we ended up using. And then we have these options that we had selected for inline search. And if you look at, we see a lot of exclusions there. And then we ended up downloading 2 items. So let's look at those items that we downloaded. So if you recall, we were looking for IP addresses starting with 74 in the headers. So that is our IP address here. In this case, something like this. So it is all over these headers. And then the proximity term, in this case, we have an attachment. So the email body, I don't think has those proximity terms, but in this case, in the attachments, if you go over to page 2, there's our proximity term with software and intellectual property. So we kind of fine-tuned our query. Basically, we would not have been able to do that header IP address type search, or even the proximity term with such detail in Gmail API. But there's also quite a bit more we can do with wildcards and all that. So essentially, this is a full-blown search engine that's quite capable, and it'll, I think, come in handy. But before I talk more about this, I want to share with you something about date searches in general, because I want to talk about how we do date searches in this inline search engine. So for that, I'll switch over to this, and I want to show you kind of an overview of date searches first, and then a couple of different thought exercises, let's say. And like I said before, if you haven't given much thought to this, it might be interesting. Maybe some of you have really done a lot of work on date searching, and you might have explored all these different options. Then you might be already familiar with this. But what I'm going to discuss now is, let's say that we are interested in running a date restriction in the context of e-discovery or digital forensics in general. And the date range we're searching against is March 3rd, 2020 to April 15, 2021. And we have an email, and we're trying to evaluate if our email is satisfying the date restriction. Email sent date is March 17, 2020. Receive date is March 18, 2020. So the pipes were clogged and it took a little while to get there. Just a better illustration this way. So in this case, both of those dates are within our target date restriction, so we're good, and the email is responsive. So one might construct a date search along these lines. Don't worry about the syntax here, but just the meaning of it. So in this case, we're searching for the sent date within our date range from 2020 March 3rd to 2021 April 15, or the receive date is within that range. So if an item has a sent date or a receive date within the time period, it is responsive. In my experience, this is quite common. A lot of the email date searches are done this way, although in some cases more terms are added to it to satisfy different criteria. But if you've seen some of our email forensics presentations, you will know that emails don't have just 2 dates. They might have many more dates. Some of these are maybe attachment dates. And when I say attachment dates, there might be attachment dates that are derived from the prior file system timestamps of an attachment before it was attached, so carryover attachment file system timestamps. And then there might be internal attachment timestamps for a type like a PDF or a Word document, for example. So there are multiple attachment timestamps, and even the internal timestamps of an attachment could be many, because there could be something like a PDF file with multiple XMP metadata streams, so it might have 10 sets of internal document timestamps. So there's quite a bit of attachment related timestamps there. And then there could be non-attachment timestamps, like maybe a timestamp that's related to a component of the email, or maybe a timestamp that's coming from an inline MIME entity that's not really an attachment, like maybe an embedded image, for example, that's not supposed to be extracted out as a separate database record. Now, when it comes to the attachments, I know that some e-discovery workflows have ways to handle them. For example, if you use a tool that extracts out attachments as separate database records, and then if those attachments are run through the same date restriction, even if the parent email was not responsive, but the attachment is responsive, then you can gather attachments, and you would get that email is responsive based on your criteria. But that is if you include it in your search expression, file system, and internal creation and modification timestamps as well. If you only search for sent and received dates, and the attachment is not going to have that. But the more concerning part of those email component timestamps, or the inline MIME entity timestamps that are not necessarily attachments. They should not be separate database records, and they are not the sent or received date of the email either necessarily. And in some cases, if you're dealing with a fraudulent email, you could even have future timestamps. You might have a timestamp that comes after the sent date of the email because something was changed in the email after the fact and doesn't really match up with the rest of the data. So the question here is, well, before the question, let me show you an example of an example email, so we can discuss what that looks like in real life. So let me pull up an example email with an attachment and some things. Okay, let's switch over to this real quick. All right, so let's take a look at this email in MIME form. So here's the MIME message, nothing too exciting there. But if you look at the attachments, it has a PDF attachment. It's dated 2019 and 2020, creation and modification time. And if you look at the structure of it, it's actually a pretty simple message. It has plain text and HTML bodies. It has an inline attachment, and it has a PDF attachment. The PDF attachment dates are not the internal dates here. These are the file system carryover dates or some other date that the email client thought to include in there. So if you were to look at the section here where these are, you would find them in the content disposition header for the attachment. If you look at the inline item, it has a content ID timestamp consistent with Outlook Desktop, and it resolves to this. Generally, it has timestamps from these MIME boundary delimiters. So if you look at all in all, there are quite a few timestamps here. There's the attachment timestamps that are before the sent date of the email from 2019 and 20. There's the content ID from June of this year, sent date from July 20th, and then a couple dates on July 24th. So quite a few timestamps, and actually this is a very simple email. You could have a scenario where your email has tens of timestamps, possibly. And while some of these might be exotic a little bit and not really too concerning in the sense of e-discovery searches, in some cases they might be very relevant, and it's important to consider, are we taking into account only the sent and received date of the email, or are we taking into account the entirety of the email's timestamps when we compose our date restriction? Now, this is something that's usually a question that should be directed to the legal team or whoever is responsible for this search, because depending on the scenario, they might have different answers. For example, I've come across some cases, I worked some cases where we were working under a stipulation or a court order, and it was very clearly spelled out, and it said, you're looking for emails with a sent date of this or a received date of this, so very exact specifications, and there's not much wiggle room there. But I found that in a lot of cases, it's actually more loosely defined, and when you ask the legal team, they are mainly interested in any date. So they say, hey, if this email has any dates within the responsive time period, it is responsive. So then you may have to adjust your thinking and how you deal with that. Or you might have a scenario where it's not really any discovery exercise, but you're investigating something and you want to know any activity within your time period, and run it against the date search to do a timeline or some type of analysis. So how can we accomplish this nicely? Because it's easy to construct the date search based on the sent and received date, or even a modification date in there, for example. But if we're talking about a single container that has a multitude of dates, what are we to do? Are we going to create a 3-paragraph date restriction that accounts for all the different kinds of dates that can be on there? Well, the idea that we came up with, and I say came up with loosely here, I don't know if there's any prior art in this area, but this is just what we thought to do in Forensic Email Collector, is to essentially mark the range of timestamps in the email with the earliest and the latest timestamp that's found in the message. So that way we represent the range with the earliest and latest boundaries, and then we can evaluate those against our date range that's our target. So in this case, for example, if we're working against a one-ended date restriction that says something like, anything after May 19, 2021 is responsive, then if you have an email that looks like this, where every timestamp is before that, then it is not responsive. Whereas if the date restriction cuts into it a little bit, then we can evaluate the latest timestamp here, and if it is after the start of our date restriction, then you can construct a term like a search like this. Latest date is later than the beginning of our date restriction, and our item would be responsive. similarly, if we approach it from the other side, and if we're looking at items that are responsive, if they are before July 15, 2019, and if we're all after it, then not responsive. If part of it cuts before the date restriction, then we have a responsive item, even if partially. Now, another variation, so this, you would construct something like this, for example. Another variation would be a two-sided date restriction, which is more common. So let's say we're looking for items dated between March 3rd, 2020 and April 15, 2022. In this case, if our email is cutting into it like this from one end, then it is responsive, or from the other end it's responsive, or it could be entirely within the date range from both sides, so it can sit squarely in the middle of the date range. And in that case, you know, to cover all three of these scenarios, you could construct a search like this. You could say if my earliest date is within the date range, or my latest date is within the date range, then that means everything else is going to be there or not. So that covers both scenarios, and you could make an effective date range restriction based on the range of dates in your email, right? So I'll give you a second to think about this. Does this cover all the scenarios, or could there be something that we're missing here? Let's take 5 seconds to give it some thought. Okay, I didn't count it, but it's probably been 5 seconds. I would say no, this doesn't cover all scenarios. What if our date restriction is narrow and it is within our email somewhere? So let's say we have an email like this with a broad spectrum of dates, and we have a narrow date restriction from December 1st, 2019 to January 1st, 2020. It falls within our email, but if we evaluate it against our prior date restriction, the earliest date is not within this date restriction. Sorry, it's not within this target date range, and the latest date is not within the target date range. But depending on how you interpret it, you could interpret this as a responsive email, because it is a container and it shows activity from before the date range and after the date range. So you could conclude that this is responsive and ultimately it should be within the date range. If you actually take a step back and think of this email as a PST container, for example, it's even clearer. But even for an individual email, I would say in most cases you would consider this responsive. Now again, this is a question for the legal team. They might say, you know what, this is not responsive, then you'd be fine. Or another legal team might say, oh yeah, of course, no question. So if you want to cover that scenario, you would add another term that covers this situation where the earliest date is before the beginning of the date range and the latest date is after the end of the date range. So our email is essentially stretched outside of the date range. Now I showed you this because we have constructed our default date restriction in a similar manner here. So let me go back to FEC 380 here and show you how this works. And this is not mandatory, of course. You can do it however you want, but I think this is a good way to think about it. So let me know your thoughts on this. So when we do an inline search and when you launch Query Builder, there's the similar stuff you're used to from before, actually. I'll show you that in a second. But if I were to do a date restriction like this and say, give me everything after 2020, then we'll construct a date search along these lines. So it'll be a range search, so it'll take latest date is essentially after this date that we specified. Same thing for before, but if we do a double one, like we did in the past, you'll find that it actually has two components. So it's going to have the earliest date or latest date part, which covers what we initially discussed. And then if you scroll over, there's the other part that covers the earliest date is before the beginning of the date range and the latest date is after the end of the date range. This is, I would say, optional, and it depends on your take on it. Feel free to exclude that from our automatically created date restrictions if you want, or if you find that you're ending up excluding it most of the time, then let us know. Maybe we'll rethink that. But I think the key takeaway here is that when you search in FEC now in an inline search, you can search for sent date and receive date and all those guys, of course, individually. But more importantly, we have the concept of earliest date and latest date here. So that is a mechanism to use a range of dates within the email rather than just the specific times. And this comes in handy because, like I said, we extract a lot of timestamps, especially from attachments and stuff, so we want to be able to represent all this nice and neat. Oh, one thing I wanted to show you was the participants part. That is pretty straightforward. So if you were to drop something here, let's see here. Do I even have that? I don't think I have a participant search here, so I'll just say so if you drop something like that, you will find that it will convert that to the inline search engine syntax in this case. It's a little different than what you see with Gmail API or Graph API or whatever else we target, but same idea. So essentially use Query Builder to your advantage. Differently than Exchange and Graph API, you can do content terms here. So these will be just direct terms essentially. So anything that you don't specify a field is going to run on the entirety of the item. So Query Builder in this case helps us accomplish both content terms, participant terms, and date restrictions. But as before, you can construct things manually. All right, so this is the end of what I have for Forensic Email Collector. Of course, you can probably guess where this search engine is going to show up next. And we have quite a few other things coming up for Forensic Email Collector too. I know there are a lot of features a lot of you have been waiting for, so those are still in the works. Expect 380 to drop very soon. We're doing some testing and fine-tuning on the inline search engine, so once that's done, we'll push this out. Hopefully it'll help some of you accomplish great things. And any questions, you should be able to send me a note here on the chat if you have anything you want to ask. If not, we can wrap it up. I'll give you guys a few seconds here. Well, it doesn't look like we have anything, so that's good. That means it was probably well understood. All right, sounds good. If you guys think of anything you'd like to ask, feel free to reach out to me. If not, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for joining and taking the time. And like I said, once we release 380,